Hi everyone, and welcome to the June tutorial, which is Kiki's delivery service. This one was super fun. It's one of the first projects that I did making the costume for my daughter. She wanted to be Kiki for a picture because I had made a Cinderella costume for her older sister. And so yeah, this one was lots of fun. And I started out this one by making a new project, which of course was the 8x10 size because that's what I like to share to social media. So it's 8x10, 4000 by 5000 pixels. And then I started by selecting out the stock and dropping that into the new image that I made. So this is the roof that Kiki's going to be standing on. And so I just selected out the rooftop from the sky and dragged and dropped it into my new layer my new file that I made. I like to keep all of my layers organized by renaming each layer, and then I also put each layer in its own folder because then that way when I'm adding new layers on top of it, then it's all going to be grouped together and organized. And then I just right-clicked on the roof layer and turned it into a smart object so I could resize it. And hit Control-T to bring up the marquee tool and resize it that way. And then I just repeated each of those steps with the rest of the building stock and sky and all that for the background. All right, and after dragging and dropping that layer in, I just put it in behind the roof there, realizing that I then had to flip the rooftop because I wanted the rooftop that Kiki would be sitting on because I wanted her to be facing out to the ocean, not the building next to it. And yeah, it looked kind of awkward, so I just flipped it horizontally. So I just went to image and then transform and then flip horizontal. And once I got that rooftop flipped, I decided that they just needed to be resized a bit, and then I cleaned up the background of the selection on the background building. The background building is a different color profile, so that's why when I dropped it in, it became like a super bright red color. But obviously that can be fixed by doing like a hue and saturation. You can desaturate it and change the color of a bit of it so that it will match properly. All right, and to create more of that townscape or cityscape, I brought in some pixel squid trees and I just placed them in between each building just to add more of that greenery that would be in a city. All right, and then here I am trying to adjust that color of that back building. It's like way too saturated, so I brought the hue and saturation in and just lowered that saturation and put a little bit more yellow into it to kind of match that foreground building, and darkened it up a little bit by just using that hue and saturation layer. And since that made the front building look a lot more saturated, I then did the same thing. I clipped a hue and saturation layer on that rooftop and just lowered it a little bit to kind of try and match them up a bit more in color tone. All right, I unlocked the layer on this one and used the remove background that's in the properties panel. To just get the rooftops in, and dragged and dropped that layer into the image, put them behind the other layers so that they're the background buildings, And then you can convert it to a smart object to resize it and put it in place. Hit Control T to get the marquee tool or the box around it. And yeah, just kind of putting in some lower buildings. So with Kiki, there's a lot of like big hills in the little town that she's in. And so I wanted to make it look like she's at the top of an enormous hill and all the houses are kind of going off into the distance down this hill. So that was kind of my thought process. I'm kind of going off of the art style and the cartoon style of Kiki's Delivery Service. And some people didn't like the background of this one particularly because they thought it didn't look realistic, but it's based on a cartoon. I wasn't specifically trying to be super realistic, if that makes sense. All right, and then once I got those buildings kind of where I wanted, I then brought in more of those trees to kind of hide the pixels in behind. And also just to add more of that greenery into my little city that I am creating. Okay, and then just unlocking that layer on this one and dragging and dropping it into my Kiki's Delivery Service layer. And yeah, just again, I think I forgot to hit to like turn this one into a smart object, but I hit Control T to just resize. But I would recommend to always turn your layers into a smart object before you resize them. And then obviously this one was in a different color preference as well, so it's quite red. So again, I'd have to go in and desaturate that. All right, and then I'm just adding in the other sky layers. I went up to layer and duplicate layer and duplicated it onto the Kiki Delivery 1 that I had made. And then I put the sky down below the other building layers. And then you would need to put a layer mask on the buildings so that I can blend the sky and get rid of that line that's happening in the sky there. All right, so I wanted this to look like a sunrise image. And so I had a picture of a sunrise and then some stars, and I dropped those in and then just played around with the blending mode to add those into the sky. And yeah, and then that just kind of added to that sky and gave it a little more interest. Again, adding in those trees from Pixel Squid in behind some of these buildings, because as you can see in the buildings in the very far background, there's trees in between all of them, and just to add to that cityscape, I wanted to add some more. When I was doing my research for Kiki's Delivery Service, a lot of them were her like flying in the sky with seagulls and all this kind of stuff. And so I definitely wanted to add those seagulls into the background. So I found a few seagull images from Adobe Stock and just brought those ones into the image as well, flying in the sky. And so I had a group of them flying in the background, and then I just selected a few individual and kind of put them around Kiki once I got her in the image as well. Of course, it would not be a Kiki's Delivery Service without Gigi. All right, and Gigi was her kitty cat. the little black cat is so cute. My favorite character of Kiki's Delivery Service for sure. And I found this one off of Adobe Stock as well. There's so many adorable black cat images on Adobe Stock. It was really hard to pick which one, but I liked this one because it looked like he was looking up to the sky, and so would my Kiki character, and so I wanted them to be looking up at the sunrise together. And how I brought Gigi into the image was the same. I just did a remove background because I believe this one was just on a white backdrop, and then I just dragged and dropped his layer into the image and then converted him to a smart object before resizing. I was not sure exactly where I wanted to place Gigi in this image, so I waited. I kind of just placed him anywhere and then figured I could change it later, so that's what I did here. Before I placed any more seagulls in the image, I wanted to get our Kiki in first, because once I had her in, I would know where the placement of the seagulls and the cat would be. So we just did this. I just did the same thing where I removed background, and as you can see, it still had my little boy in there. He and my other daughter were helping kind of make that skirt look like it was flying. So I just had to use a black brush to paint him out. This selection worked amazing on her hair, and it saved all of those cute little wisps, and I absolutely love that. I'm so happy it did that. It worked really, really well. And then once I turned her into a smart object by right clicking and then converting to smart object, I had to flip her going the other direction because that is where the sunrise is coming. Right, and after I figured out all of the placement, I just went in with those brightness and contrast layers and kind of tried to make them fit a little more into the scene. I remembered from the Harry Potter image that I did of my nephew chasing the snitch that there was a witch's broom in there, or a wizard's broom. And I decided she needed a broom. I mean, she's a witch who's learning to fly or loses her ability to fly and trying to, it's just such a cute story, and it needed a broom. So I brought that one in from Pixel Squid and kind of tried to figure out how would she be holding it because of the way her arms are. So I figured I would try to get it, placed within the crook of her arm there. Got the placement of the broom figured out. I put a layer mask on it, and then with my black brush at a fairly hard amount, I believe I had it at about 85 here, I just figured out how to paint it, how I wanted to paint it out. So the sleeve and her hand would be covering the broom up, and so I just had to paint out the one part of its handle. Here are the seagulls that I chose from Adobe Stock to be flying around Kiki in the sky. And so I just used the quick selection tool to pick my favorites and drag and drop those into my image. I wanted to use the seagulls to kind of create a little bit of depth into the image as well, so that's why I have one that looks like it's closer to my camera and then others in behind Kiki, just to create that distance. And then I grouped all of these birds, and then on the group I put a brightness and contrast layer and just brought the contrast and brightness down on these birds. I do end up moving the front seagull here at this point, but I end up moving it back because it really does need that depth, and I wanted her to look like she's being like circled by the seagulls. So yeah, I do end up moving it back in front. And on top of the birds folder, I do add a color balance as well to kind of add a little more yellow tones to it, because it is a sunrise, so they're going to have the warm tones in their highlights and kind of a cooler tone into their shadows. So you can actually go up to the tone in this palette and adjust only those things. So you can go to highlights and add more yellow, and you can go into shadows and add more of the blue, which is what I did here. All right, and on my daughter here, I wanted her shoes to be red because Kiki's shoes are red, and so I just put a solid color on her and made it that bright red tone. And you can invert that layer mask. I guess I put it on a overlay, and then you can invert that layer mask and paint it onto the spots that you want it to be. And here I am playing around with the placement of the birds yet again. It does take some, moving things around and just seeing how it's looking, and it's just part of the process of creating a composite like this. All right, and then once I got finished with messing with those birds again, I just went through each of the layers and did a color adjustment on them, played with their tone with the brightness and contrast layers. And you also want to go through each one and blur depending on how far away from the camera it would be. So Kiki and the cat and the roof are in the front foreground are going to be sharp, whereas everything else is going to be a variant degree of blurredness. I know blurredness is not a word, but we're going to go with it. So here I am just adding the Gaussian blur noise, making color adjustments and darkening everything. So just like in all of my other tutorials, I add the brightness and contrast, color balance in there, and kind of just try to match those things up by using these. And then on each piece of stock, I'm going in and adding a little bit of Gaussian blur depending on how far back behind the subject it is. So the building behind her, I think I put it at maybe like 1.5. Then the next set of buildings, maybe like 2.5. And then the background, the sky would be even more, like 4. And so that's how I did that. And then on each piece of stock as well, if you zoom in and it needs a little bit of grain, I add a little bit of grain as well by adding noise. So you go again up to filter, noise, and add a little bit of that. So here I am adding in that blur. Like I said, I put it at 1.5 and blurring all of the trees and everything as well. Okay, so and then once I got all of those layers blurred and added the noise, I then went into my daughter's selection and just cleaned her up and the broom up to make sure that the selection is nice and clean. Alright, and I wanted it to look like her skirt was more blowing in the wind, so I just brought her into Liquify. So you go up to Filter and then Liquify, and I just wanted to add a little more of that wave to the skirt so it looks like it's blowing in the wind. And then I also did the same with her hair. All right, and then so of course my daughter is standing on something, so we need to ground her. So under Kiki, we want to place a shadow. Actually, I realized that it needs to be on the roof and clipped down to the roof so that I'm not accidentally painting on the building behind her. So I just clipped that down to the roof and added it to multiply, and now we are going to paint over that one. And I made a second one for the highlights. Also at this point I realized that the roof is the wrong direction for the sunlight. So because the sun is coming in on the other side, I needed to have shadows where all the highlights were. So it took a lot of extra work just painting those shadows and highlights in. Alright, and with Gigi here, I just put a puppet warp on him because I liked the placement of his head and everything, but I wanted to actually make it look like he's sitting on a bumpy roof, like his tail wouldn't just be straight like that. So I just used a puppet warp just to kind of create a little bit of a wave in his tail so that he looks like he's actually sitting on this textured roof. And then little Gigi's selection needed to get cleaned up, and so I just went in with my brush and cleaned up his edges, and then I went in with my fur brush to make him look like he's still furry. And you can find the fur brush tutorial on my YouTube channel. I will link it to this tutorial so you can find it, and it'll actually teach you how to make your own fur brush and how to use it. Doing lots of work on little Gigi. We also needed to add the color balance to make him a little warmer because again it is a sunrise image, and then add in a little more brightness into him to brighten up his highlights. And then we're gonna add that highlight and shadow layer and clip that to Gigi as well. Those highlight and shadow layers, the shadow layer again is always on multiply and the highlight layer is always on overlay. That's how I use them. And then with my dark brush, I'm going to choose a darker color and paint in those shadows on Gigi, and then again with a warmer tone brush, maybe even that orange from the sky, paint on those highlight colors. All right, and because we did make some changes on Gigi, his placement with the puppet warp, we need to adjust the shadow underneath him as well. So that's what I'm doing here. And then we get into fixing the rooftop shadow as well. The shadow layer underneath Gigi is actually that rooftop shadow that's clipped down to the rooftop, because you want it underneath, and by clipping it to the rooftop, you know you're not going to accidentally paint a shadow on any other part of your image. And that broom was looking pretty fake, so I had to add the shadow and highlight layer. And so, of course, like always, the shadows are on multiply and the highlights are on overlay. And just adjusting the color tone as well, to add a little bit more yellow into it, because it is, again, it's a sunrise image, so it needs to be a little bit warmer. And then, yeah, just painting in those shadows. So painting the underside of the broom with the shadow, and then the top part of the broom with the highlight, so that it looks the same as my daughter's lighting, for example. And then, of course, I continue to add those shadow and highlight layers on the other pieces of stock, such as the trees, and that building in behind, just to make sure that all of the lighting added up and looked the same. And here I am just adding the last highlight and shadow layer on the tree, just in the background. And again, multiply for the shadows and overlay on the highlights layer. And I'm just selecting that dark green color and painting in those shadows that would be in behind those buildings there, and then painting on the highlights where the sun would be shining on the leaves. I just left the painting here at the normal speed so you guys can kind of see what it is that I'm doing for this particular part. And I basically just did all of this painting with the shadow and highlights on everything else in this photo. So basically painting extra shadows on the building in behind, and just making sure that everything looks like it's in the same image together with that sunrise shining on them. Right, and because that front building is like so warm, the other buildings in behind needed to have that same warm tone to it. And so what I did with the highlights was I selected the rooftop that she's standing on, that really nice like warm red color, and just chose with the dauber, like the little paintbrush dauber thing, I chose like a bit of a brighter tone of that same color, so kind of that peachy tone, and then I just painted that on as the highlights on the other buildings in the background, because I wanted to have that same warm sunrise tone to all of the buildings, and they needed that extra brightness on them, on the highlights especially. And the brush that I'm using is a very soft brush, and I'm only painting it on at about 10% opacity on the buildings in the background. And this is painting it on just the highlighted areas, and then working on the shadows as well, just to deepen some of those shadows on the shadow layer. Okay, and then when I was working on the background layer here, I felt like I needed to take some of the blue out a little bit, so I just went back into the color balance layer and reduced a little bit of the blues. I felt like I had it up just a little too high. And on the building in behind her, I just felt like it needed a little something else. So I brought in some vines from Pixel Squid and added it to the top of the roof. Yeah, it just to add a little bit of interest and also a little bit more greenery to the cityscape. And of course, when adding in new pieces of stock, you do need to, with Pixel Squid, I always turn the shadows off, and then I put it on high resolution. The reason I like to turn the shadows off is because I would much rather paint in my own shadows and make sure that the lighting is looking the right direction. Once you have that in, then you would add the brightness and contrast layer, you would add the color balance layer to make sure it's matching all of the rest of your image, and then add in those highlights and shadow layers. And then I went to the building layer, the building shadow layer, and painted a little bit of shadows on the underside of those plants as well. All right, and then I moved up to the birds and did the same thing. So on each of these birds, you want to add a shadow and a highlight layer. I guess what I did, because they're all kind of the same color tone and stuff, I had put them all in a folder, and so I just clipped down the shadow and the highlight layer to the birds folder. And that's going to make sure that if I did any painting on these layers, it's only going to be on the birds, and it won't touch any of the other stock, and it won't bleed into the sky, for example, if I was adding a shadow. So yeah, I think with the highlights, I just chose that really warm orange color and really accentuated the orange tones of the sunrise. And one of my favorite things about Kiki's delivery service is her little stereo that she attaches to her broom. And so it couldn't be Kiki without her little red stereo. And so I found this stock from Adobe Stock, and I chose to just kind of select the one radio part of it because it is like just a little square red box. Originally I had made one out of paper, but it was pretty terrible. I tried, but I failed pretty good. So I just decided to make my own and select this part of the stereo to make one. And yeah, I think I just used the transform tool to make it look a little longer and a little more square. Or rectangular, sorry. I just used the quick selection tool to quickly select the part of the stereo that I wanted to keep. And then I just cleaned up the selection with a black brush. And then you can just drag and drop that layer into your image that you're creating. And always turn it into a smart object when you do that as well. To resize, you just hit Control T and then you can resize it. But of course, this is after you turned it into a smart object. And then I just unlocked the little chain and just made it a little bit more rectangular versus square. And then you can hit Control T again to resize it to the right size for, you know, to be hanging from her little broom. Alright, and I did not like the orange tone of it, so I just opened up a hue and saturation and played around with the saturation and the hue to make it look more red. And then I just darkened it up because it is behind her. It's going to be blocked a little bit from the light. And so yeah, I just played around with the hue and saturation until it got to like matching a little bit of her headband and shoes. I wanted it to be more of that red tone versus the kind of... Once I got the color tone pretty close with that hue and saturation, I then brought in a color balance and just added some more red to get it more matching that headband color. And then I cleaned up the stereo selection. Okay, and then on the stereo, I made 2 more paint layers for the shadow and highlights and clipped those down to the stereo. And what I'm doing is selecting the dark red tone of her shoes to paint, use that color for the shadows on the stereo. And then for the highlights, I just selected a brighter tone of the red in her headband to paint in the highlights for the stereo. And then I just made my brush really small and painted in a string. And what you can do is when you're painting, you press down on the shift key and click from the start to where you want it to go, and it will make a straight line. And I just kind of played around with the placement of how I wanted it to look. And then I painted some string around the end of her broom. And to make the string look even more realistic, you of course want to add shadow and highlight layers on the string as well as on the broom, because the string would still have a little bit of shadow from being tied around it. So what I did is on that broom layer for the shadows on the broom, I just added some more shadows underneath the string. And then of course painted on the shadow and highlights on the string itself, clipping a couple of layers to that as well. And once I got those shadows painted in, it was a finished image. So this is the end of our tutorial for our Kiki delivery service image. I hope you guys really liked this one. Please comment below any questions that you might have, and I will answer them for you. Next month's tutorial will be our Moby Dick image, and I'm super excited for this one. The Moby Dick one was so much fun to do, and I can't wait to share it with you guys. And this one, the Moby Dick one, has a lot of stock that I created myself from when we were visiting PEI, so I'll be sharing that stock with you guys as well. So again, I hope you enjoyed this one, and we'll see you in next month's tutorial. Bye guys!